to Diverse STEM Reading, a layer cake of problems. My name is Erin Thomas. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm an engineering librarian at Parks Library. Megan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, my name's Megan O'Donnell. My pronouns are she, her, hers as well. I am a data services librarian, but I also serve a couple of the natural science departments as well as the environmental programs as their subject librarian.
Yep, so we are presenting today, as you may have guessed, on diverse STEM reading and a number of issues that contribute to the problem of a lack of diverse options for STEM reading. So we'll dig into those in just a moment. But first, we have a couple of acknowledgements that we want to do and some context setting for this. So first up, the land acknowledgement. We're presenting today from Ames, Iowa, near Iowa State University. Before this site became ISU, it was the ancestral lands and territory of the Bajoje or Iowa Nation. The United States obtained this land from the Meskwaki and Sauk nations in the Treaty of 1842. We wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it before us, as well as to the Native people who live in Iowa today. We also want to acknowledge our own privilege before we go into this. So Megan and I are two white women. We're part of a discipline that is largely white women. And we also want to acknowledge that libraries have a history of being fairly conservative, if not outright regressive, on issues of race, ethnicity, identity, and culture, and that this is not just a historical problem within libraries and librarianship. These problems persist today. What we're trying to do here is to leverage our privilege as librarians, as gatekeepers to information, in order to help make things better. But we also recognize that we are limited by that privilege. So with that in mind, we do welcome comments and critiques after the session, and also questions that you may have, and we'll leave time for that at the end. All right, so why are we doing this? We first started doing this work by co-teaching a library research session for a course on women in science and engineering. As part of our work for that, we tried to find materials on these subjects that we could highlight for the students, and we ran into a lot of roadblocks. We're also fans of own voices in fiction, where diverse books with diverse characters are written by authors who are from that same group and which reflect the experiences that those authors have. We're also hoping to see a shift from books on how to diversify STEM to books that demonstrate and celebrate that diversity. So Parks Library has a pretty good collection of how-to type books relating to diversity in the STEM fields. But we have a lot smaller, less complete collection of books that reflect diverse experiences within STEM. We've found that most of the diverse books are about white women, or they're those how-to type manuals. And in this presentation, we'll talk about how that situation came to be and ways that we're trying to move forward from there.
All right, so to succinctly state the problem, as librarians, one of our primary mechanisms for demonstrating value on campus and to our community, as well as being proactive with change and support, is through obtaining and buying books. And that means being aware of who is producing those books, how they're made, and how they get to our shelves. But as Erin has mentioned, we can't obtain things that don't exist. There are a lot of books on how to diversify STEM, about research done in diversity and recruitment in STEM. And our library has a great collection in this area. But actually getting books about the scientists, engineers, doctors, and other STEM professionals written by people in the field who are not mostly white men and white women has been difficult. the majority of books on STEM professionals are about white men. And earlier, or I guess in February, I did a just really basic search in Google, famous scientists, and I got a whole bunch of old white guys. Albert Einstein, Marie Curie was a woman, which was fantastic. But then I had to go down the list. And I finally got to Rosalind Franklin and George Washington Carver, and those were the only people other than Marie Curie who are not white men. Marie Curie is probably the most well-known female scientist, and the reason we are only seeing a couple of women and people of color in this list is because historically STEM has a history of exclusion of women, of people of color, of members of the queer community, and more. And that the dominant narrative, especially in the publishing field, is that of the white male hero and that of Western culture, which, since they excluded everyone else, that's also all the books we get. So as an example of how this plays out in library collection building, we have nearly 350 books about Einstein, but we only have 35 books on Marie Curie. Marie Curie was born 12 years before Einstein. So this isn't a time period issue. This isn't a lack of interest issue. This is a exclusion issue. The other thing to note is that there are a lot of books for young adults and children about women in STEM and people of color in STEM, which is fantastic. But as an academic research library, we kind of want to be able to support our adult community and our researchers more than just children and young adults, especially the fiction books.
All right, so STEM, let's dig into that a little bit. So the STEM fields have known diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. These issues differ a little bit depending on which field you're looking at. You'll see different groups are more or less underrepresented. But generally speaking, women and Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations are underrepresented across the board. And I'm going to bring up a couple of slides with charts that show pretty starkly exactly how this works out. So the first one is scientists and engineers by ethnicity and race. The data is from 2017. We don't really have newer data yet that we can work with. This comes from the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. So this is United States. As you can see, the largest chunk by far is white, followed by Asian, with much smaller chunks for African American, Hispanic, or Latino, and other groups. Some of them are so small you can barely see them. Okay. The second chart is women in science and engineering over time from 1993 to 2017. And there's a couple of things you can see from this chart, which is this is over time. And you can see that the lines are going up, but generally not very fast. You can also see that with the exception of social scientists, all of them are below 50% women by the end of this time period. And most of them started out well below 50%. Engineering still lags way, way behind in terms of getting women into the field and keeping women in the field. So these things combined mean we already have fewer diverse voices in the field. So these are, we have fewer people who can write books and share their experiences or other materials, not just books, as a preview of what's to come. We have fewer people to have books written about them, to do things like win Nobel Prizes, as Marie Curie did, which is part of why she's so famous. So the STEM diversity issue is a large component of why there's such a dearth of these materials in the first place, but it's not the only layer at work here.
That was a great lead in, Erin, because
you're welcome.
I get to now talk about the publishing layer. So a lot of us don't really think about publishing, except that we might know the names of our favorite publishers. I know I do. I read a lot of fiction books for fun, and I also know my favorite publishers as a librarian for acquiring books. We, as librarians, we know quite a bit about publishers, but we're not on the production end, we're on the receiving end. And so what gets published, what these publishing companies are creating, has a huge influence on what shows up in libraries and what's available to readers in bookstores. And you probably won't be surprised to learn that it's very biased, like STEM, and it acts as an amplifier for the dominant groups, which are mostly white people, and is a gatekeeper for other folks. The labels on this slide are mostly illustrative more than factual, but I did look all these folks up. So in this case, they're probably also factual. And this is about plants. Anyone can study plants. So taking a look at the publishing industry, it is very white, very female, very straight, and very Western. It's also primarily folks who do not self-identify as being disabled, and that includes mental health disabilities, not just physical. There is not a lot of data about who is publishing which books, so whose voices are being amplified and which are being kept out, for example. But one piece of data I did find was that almost 90% of the mainstream fiction books published in 2018 were written by white authors. This was from 3 major fiction publishers. If 90% of the voices are just from one group, that's pretty exclusionary. And we expect that the statistic is probably similar for books about STEM practitioners as well. The other thing to note is that publishing is a very old industry, dates back to at least the 1700s, earlier than that, and it is slow to change. One of the more troubling pieces of information I found was that over 70% of the folks who work in scholarly publishing, which is journals and scholarly books, such as maybe if you publish your thesis or dissertation, or if you write a contribute to a book chapter, those folks have no training in diversity and inclusion. So the majority of these folks are not aware there is a problem, which means they also cannot work to correct the problem of inclusion and diversity in their industry. So this quote from Leon Lowe Books, who does a diversity in publishing survey, really captures it with the quote. So even though more diverse books are being published now, it's fair to assume that the large majority of them are still being acquired and edited by white people. So while our talk focuses on popular, mostly and nonfiction books related to STEM, I do want to note that this amplification and gatekeeping issue extends beyond that. And there are lots of accounts and also scholarship about the gatekeeping that occurs in academic publishing as well.
And the third layer in our lovely layer cake that we will be addressing today is libraries. So libraries tend to have a very good reputation, I think, among most people. They're sort of put on a pedestal, and there's a number of reasons for that, which I will get into shortly. However, they can also be obstacles to change in much the same way as publishing. Libraries are also pretty old institutions. They tend to be slow to change, and perhaps unsurprisingly, library workers are overwhelmingly white. They also share many of the other demographic attributes of folks in the publishing industry. I have a chart on this slide from a study of the members of the Association of Research Libraries. So these tend to be academic libraries in higher education, which found quite recently that 71% of library workers at these institutions are white. At ISU, that number is quite a bit higher. I'm not going to go into much detail about that here. If you're interested, there is a presentation on Friday from Susan Vega Garcia that talks about inclusion at Parks Library, and she will be speaking about all of that. So if you're interested, attend her presentation. We're going to keep going here. So in addition to being overwhelmingly white and straight and cisgendered and so on, library workers also have some professional values that sound good on the surface, but can cause some problems. So for one thing, library workers tend to be white. They may not have any training in diversity, equity, and inclusion. They may not have any understanding of issues related to those areas. So it may just not at all be on their radar when they're buying books, when they're helping visitors to the library find materials. It may just not even enter their mind. But it's not just demographics and history that present challenges. We do also have to contend with professional values such as neutrality and the idea of presenting all sides of an issue in some way within library materials, as well as serving the public good. And these may all sound good on the surface, and to some extent they are. This is one reason why many librarians, and indeed some people outside of the library profession, view librarianship as being on this pedestal above questioning, above reproach. However, this can become its own barrier because it leads folks to refuse to question the status quo, and it leads them to deny that problems exist at all. So that's one obstacle, is the whole library staff end of it. It ties in a little bit with some other issues. So even when libraries have materials from diverse authors or about diverse people, they can still be really hard to find, even if we have them. So one reason for this is library cataloging. And Megan and I could probably do an entire presentation on how problematic library cataloging practices are, but that's not our topic today, so I'm going to stick to just a quick overview. Some examples of how cataloging makes this harder than it needs to be is it tends to use, it's slow to change. So it may use terms that were in use when they created the terms, but it's now 25 years later and nobody uses that word anymore, or that set of terms together. We change what things mean when we're speaking normally, but the cataloging system doesn't. So you end up with outdated terms, terms that are problematic or derogatory or otherwise non-preferred, yet they're still in the catalog, and that's what you have to use to search to find those materials. Cataloging also does this fun thing where white men are the norm. So if you look up books with the subject heading scientists, you are going to get white men. You have to look up women scientists to get women, or African American scientists to get the African American scientists. They're not necessarily scientists. They are othered. And you also run into an extra fun problem for, especially for STEM topics like this, where the categories used in subject headings may be too narrow to be useful. So if you search for African American scientists, you will not get the items that are under the subject heading African American chemists. You need to know that they're under chemists and not scientists. So this makes it a pain to find diverse materials, even if the library has them, and even if you have some idea of what to search for. However, all of these cataloging issues, they assume that the book has actually got to the library, and many of them slip through the cracks even before they get to the library. So the companies that sell books to libraries, particularly academic libraries, they focus on large academic publishers. Publishers of STEM books, but not necessarily books on topics relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM. Those tend to fall more towards small publishers, independent presses, or even self-publishing. And these are great venues for getting those voices out there. However, the vendors that sell books to libraries just ignore them. They don't cover those things. So this means that if a librarian does want to build a collection in this area or make sure that all of the good materials that are coming out these days are collected and brought into the library and made discoverable for folks on campus, you have to go outside of the library purchasing system to identify these books. There's special procedures that take extra work in order to order them. They take more work for the folks who do the cataloging because they've not necessarily ever been cataloged before, especially if they are self-published. You can't look at other libraries to see how the cataloging has been done. So librarians may not have the time to do all of that extra work to go outside of these systems and find the books, or they may not have the interest to spend all of that time tracking them down. Another issue that comes up, and there's a long-standing debate among librarians about this, is whether to label diverse books or not label them. So this would be where you would, I know at Ames Public Library, they put stickers on the spines of the books that are mysteries or science fiction or fantasy and so on. And some libraries do similar things for diverse books. So they'll label them as an African-American author or as a multicultural book, however they're defining that. However, this leads to some of the same issues that I mentioned before with the subject headings, where the norm, the standard becomes white, straight, cisgendered author, and everyone else gets othered. They get labeled because they're not white. So this can lead to further marginalization. It makes it easier for people to avoid those books if they don't wish to be exposed to those topics. In cases of LGBTQ authors and trans authors, it can lead to outing and dead naming, and they may not want to do that. You can also end up with labels that are outdated or too granular, just like you can with the subject headings. On the other hand, not labeling diverse books as such can lead to a lot of missed opportunities. It becomes harder for people to find them even when they are seeking out those perspectives. There's no way in the library catalog to tell the identity of an author. You get the name. If you're lucky, you get a birth date and death date. That's about all that you get. There's no indication if it's a man, woman, non-binary. There's no indication of LGBTQ identity or racial or ethnic identity. So without a label that would tell you that, you have no way of knowing that unless you go outside the library system to discover authors and then go back to the library search system to see what's available. So this quote comes from a guest librarian posting on the Liadlo blog. I thought it really captured the essence of this issue. Labeling books by or about BIPOC is to declare them different because of who they are, and that they are only interesting because of how they contrast with whiteness. Labeling does not celebrate diversity, but instead centers whiteness as the norm and relegates BIPOCness to the abnormal, thereby reinforcing white supremacy. It's not necessarily as clear cut as that, because I think there are reasons to label these books, because I know folks are looking for them. Megan and I get questions about that fairly frequently, but we do have to be very thoughtful about how we present that information.
Right. So now you guys know what Erin and I have deep conversations about when we get upset by something, which is usually the systems we have to work within. So the question is, what can we do? And by we mean not just we, the librarians, but we as a society and as consumers of media. So
yes, I'm on this slide.
Erin,
I
you're
can
on
take
this
this
slide.
one. So one thing you can do is learn how to use the systems that we have to your advantage. And there's a link at the bottom of this slide that goes to a guide that Megan and I put together that has tons of links to the types of materials that we do have available in the library and on the web. And also some information on search techniques that will help you cover more bases with your searching when you're looking for these things. So I'm not going to go into tons of detail here. All of the information is on that guide, but these are useful strategies that you can use in a lot of different search tools to help you find stuff and rule out things that you don't want. Because I've found that particularly as I've searched for materials relating to diversity in engineering, I get lots and lots of other meanings of diversity that are not the one I'm going for. So I have to weed out a lot of stuff. And you'll probably find that the same thing is true if you try and look for some of these materials in our library systems. So you can use control terms called Boolean operators to tell the computer what words you want combined and how you want them combined. So, and if you put it between two words, it means both of them have to be present. If you put or between two words, it means either one is fine. So you could do Latina or Latino. That would be a way to use. Or then you would get either of those or both, depending on the thing. And not is really valuable for this type of searching because it just knocks off anything that has the term following it. So if I want to get rid of things that are showing up because they have the word biodiversity in them, I can say not biodiversity. Megan's laughing, but I run into that all the time. You can use quotation marks to tell the computer that this is a phrase and I want these words to appear in this exact order together. So an example of where this is useful is something like indigenous scientists. If you don't put the quotes around it, you will get lots of articles about scientists studying indigenous peoples. You will not find materials about indigenous people who are scientists. Advanced search can also be your friend, including in Google. Many people don't know that it has one, but it does if you can find it. This will typically give you a lot more options for pre-limiting searches. So you can restrict by date ranges, you can specify where and how in your results you want your words to appear, whether they all need to be together, and so on and so forth. So whatever search tool you're using, if you're not getting good results, look for that and see where you can make tweaks. And if you're using library search tools, look for subject headings. They're not always called subject headings. Sometimes they're called descriptors or keywords, but they connect materials based on what those materials are about. So if you find a book that's really relevant or an article that is really spot on for a topic that you're interested in researching or a person that you're looking for, see if there's a subject heading or two that's useful, and you can typically just click that and it will bring you a list of all of the materials in the system that have that same subject heading. Can make it a little bit less painful to try and find more materials on that topic. So as you may have guessed, this can get pretty complex. That is why we have librarians. We know how to navigate these systems, and we are happy to help construct any searches that you might need if you're looking for this type of material. All right, so the previous slide was a lot of what you can do within the systems that we currently have. That's not always the best option. I have to be honest. Libraries have limitations. We have limited budgets. We can only fit so many books in our building because we only have so much shelving. And we also are humans with limited time, limited energy, and lots of other things demanding our attention at any particular time. So there are things that librarians miss even when they're trying to find these materials. There are things that just get missed regardless, particularly self-publishing and independent publishers. So one thing that you can do is seek those publishers out. They tend to have more variety, better representation of different groups, and less gatekeeping. They can be difficult to find, but it's not impossible. Some places that you can look for these things, Google and Google Books are great sources of information. You can use -sign instead of not to knock off things that are not relevant, which can be really helpful for some of these topics. Amazon is a huge publisher of self-published books. I don't typically recommend them for things, but for finding self-published books, they are pretty great. And that includes the book that was mentioned in the tweet that's pictured on this slide, and a couple of others that I've purchased recently for the library. You can also check a website called WorldCat. It's just worldcat.org. And this is sort of a catalog of things that are owned by libraries around the world. And if you can find it in WorldCat, we can probably borrow it from a different library on your behalf. You can also try searching on Twitter. People on Twitter are full of brilliant and amazing recommendations for books in all areas. Oftentimes they post about them, and they post reviews, they post recommendations, lists of readings, all sorts of great stuff. You might be surprised by how helpful that actually can be. I know I was when I first started digging into this. And another thing that you can do, which Megan and I are hoping you will take advantage of, is you can tell us what you find, and you can recommend purchases for the library collection. We are always happy to add materials to the library collection that are going to be useful for folks on campus, and this topic area is no exception.
So yeah, as Erin mentioned, we happily take recommendations. And we definitely, this is an area Erin and I are passionate in and want to see grow, but there are in our collection, but there are also so many good resources that aren't books in art and libraries. And I had the privilege and a fun time exploring these in more detail in the last few weeks. And folks, there is so much good stuff out there that I would get distracted and forget that I needed to finish my slides for this talk. And then realize like 30 minutes had passed because I was like just jumping from cool video to some cool Twitter thing. And I'm like, all these things need to be shared, but we don't have time for that in our talk. So other things that, especially if you're a STEM educator, to think about is incorporating podcasts. I personally love podcasts because I can do things with my hands while I'm listening to them. I tend to like to sketch or take notes by hand because it helps me remember. Not all podcasts are transcribed, however, so that can be an accessibility issue. But it is possible to get transcriptions for most of them. Online videos are also absolutely a fantastic resource. I just assembled a short playlist of 30 videos that I found while exploring YouTube. There's screen caps from 2 of them here. One was by a talk by a graduate student with schizophrenia, and another one was about imposter syndrome and talked about how imposter syndrome is higher in frequency among women and also people of color and other folks because of all the barriers it takes for them to become professionals in their field. There's also quite a few good documentaries. Some of them are upcoming. Earlier this, was it last week? Last week we had a chance to view the Bearded Lady Project. I watched it. It was awesome. That documentary should be coming out soon. And then there's another one that's also coming out soon called Picture a Scientist. And I'm really looking forward to picking up for the library if possible. Another thing that I, as someone who has a fine art and a biology background, hadn't thought about was to tap into oral histories. The Iowa State University Library's Special Collections and University Archives has a collection of oral histories from people at Iowa State that especially are focused on women in STEM. And those are fully transcribed and on Aviary. And Rosie, if you're at our presentation, thank you for all your work getting that done. That was one of the other things that distracted me because I started listening to them and then realized I had like a meeting to go to and I wasn't able to finish the one I was listening to. I wanted to really include feature films on this list, but it's crossed out for a reason. And the reason is, other than one or two films, I could not find any good feature films that depict working STEM professionals, scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and more that weren't white men. So I think I had two, and Erin's recommendation to put Black Panther on there because Shuri is awesome was fantastic, but that still only brought us to 3 movies, which is 3 feature films, which is really sad. So I can't recommend feature films as a resource. They're better for children and K through 12 education, but at the college level, it is not good for this topic at all. So in summary, diverse STEM books and other diverse STEM materials can be difficult to locate, but they can be located with a little bit of work, and it's not that much work. And actually, we've even done some of the work for you with that website we built, and we'll visit it later during Q&A. Something to note is that some of the self-published materials are not as likely to have transcriptions or subtitles, though the culture for these producers is changing, and so a lot more of them are accessible than it used to be. And then it may take a little bit of extra work on your part to obtain or incorporate these materials. And I mean that both for me as a librarian, I have to do more searches, I have to go explore different types of resources to find the books I want to buy, but I also mean that as educators. So it's really easy to do a Google search for good STEM book, and you'll mostly find ones about white men. And so the idea is put in a little extra work, and it's worth it because these materials do exist and they're worth incorporating and using and reading and enjoying yourselves. And then lastly, Erin and I would really like to help with this. So if you do want to incorporate more diverse STEM materials in your instruction, in your reading groups, in your classes, please let us know. This is an area that is evolving, and we do know some tricks because we've been doing this for a few years now, and we'd like to put them to use.
All right, so that is the end of our presentation, but we'd like to end with a reminder that we do have this library guide website that we put together. It has links to tons of great stuff and sort of an overview of what we went over today and all of those tips for finding things. We want to remind you that you can help shape what goes into the library's collection, and we mean you here as inclusively as possible. So faculty, staff, undergrads, folks in the community here in Ames, people who are women or people of color or LGBTQ authors of these materials. We do want to hear from you if you know about stuff, because we're good at finding stuff, but we can't find everything all on our own. So if you need to get in touch, our email addresses are on this slide. They're also, we have email buttons on the guide webpage that you can use to send us an email.
Is the screen showing the webpage now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So
I had to look over my main screen at my screen that I'm using to keep tabs on the Zoom presentation, but yes.
And the other thing you can, if you want to know why we called this a layer cake, there's a short explanation down here on the website as well. But other than that, let me go back to the slides. I think we're ready for some Q&A. Oh, so Chris Stacy Bates, who's one of our coworkers, mentioned Shuri and Black Panther, and she assumes Hidden Figures was another. And then the third one was like maybe Imitation Game, but it's been a few years since I watched it, and I remember it being a good movie, but I didn't look at it through a very critical lens when I was watching it. So, and that was it. So that's not a very good list.
No.
Sorry, Brian, I interrupted you.
No, I was going to ask that for you, but for folks who do have questions, if you could use the chat function if you're in the Zoom, you're also allowed to unmute yourself as well if you'd like to. And then for folks who are using the web version through Hova, if you want to ask a question through the Q&A as well, you're more than welcome
to. I should mention, I think Erin mentioned this, we could do individual talks on a lot of these different topics, but we wanted to give a bigger overview and the story of how all these things work together to impact what's available and how representation works in STEM media and books.